have more for you on everyone's favorite topic, Zionism, of course, and why it actually plays into this split that we're seeing in MAGA over a potential war with Iran. There's one thing I wish I'd made more clear in my last video, and wish that more people understood in general, is that being Jewish is not just a religion, and it's not just an ethnicity. Jewishness, or being a Jew, is considered an ethno-religion. And I think that this is why it's really confusing for people, why certain things are anti-Semitic. Because there are so few Jews in the world, most people don't necessarily encounter one. Jews come from all different races, come from all different countries. People who are less familiar with Jews tend to identify it mostly as a religion, meaning that you can convert in or out, you can denounce it, you can choose to believe it or not. Even Jews who consider themselves non-believers or non-observers can still be, and have still been historically, considered Jews by non-Jews. And also, Jews themselves believe that if you are Jewish, you can't technically convert out, or even if you're an atheist, that you are still a Jew. Here's where Zionism comes in. The concept of Zionism, the broadest concept that you could assign to that word, which is that Jewish people have an ancestral tie to Israel and Jerusalem specifically, that concept cannot be separated from the ethno-religion that is Jewishness. Because that definition is so broad and so undefined and is inherent in the Jewish culture and religion, Jews see themselves as Zionists under that definition. However, there has never been an agreed upon definition of Zionism, even amongst Jews. In my last video, I had said that the concept of Zionism had sort of become irrelevant to most American Jews. And that's true because that idea of Zionism, the establishment of a state, country, government in Israel that is a Jewish country, that's the frame in which this iteration of Zionism was thought of by most Americans. Now, the people who are thinking most about Zionism now are people who are in Israel, and they all have different definitions. And the debate within Israeli society over what Zionism means, what it should mean, is so particular and contradictory on so many levels. Because I'm familiar with the contours of the disagreements amongst Jews and Israelis and American Jews about Zionism and anti-Zionism and what it means. That's why I find it really fascinating to have random commenters tell me what Zionism is. This must be one of our wily little Jewish tricks, because the only people who seem to be able to agree on what the term means are people who hate Jews and people who want to use the term Zio or Zionazi or Zionist as slurs and as their intellectual cover to justify hating Jews. And you know what the saddest part is? It's not even original. If you want to know why Jews freak out when there's extremism on the right and extremism on the left, it's because that's the shape that anti-Semitism takes. It takes the shape of hatred from both the far right and both the far left. The use of the word Zio can be traced back to far-right David Duke, but these days it's more typically used by leftists and bots. You can trace this back to when there was an original Zionist movement, which even at the time, the original Zionists were never able to agree on what Zionism meant, what their movement wanted. You know the joke, one Jew, two synagogues? It's a real thing. It has been over a century that both the far right and far left wing have been trying to smear the Jews under the name Zionist, which Jews themselves can't even agree on whether they are one, what they think that is. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the Jewish plot to take over the world. That idea first came from something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which sprang from Imperial Russia in 1903, had been translated into multiple languages and disseminated globally until it was finally exposed as fraudulent by the British newspaper The Times in 1921. So for 15 to 20 years, you had people really thinking that there was a meeting of Jews and that this book was a physical record of those Jews' plot to take over the world. And even though it had been debunked in 1921, in 1933, Germany started having teachers teach it as if it was factual to children. You've heard me talk about horseshoe theory before and the concept of the red-brown alliance, which is when the far right and the far left align. Something you may have observed this past week in the discussion about Iran. Now, I'm not saying I support going to war with Iran, but just something to notice. And while the far right and the far left can disagree on pretty much everything, one thing they can agree on and have historically always agreed on is that they hate Jews. To demonstrate this point, earlier this week, you had 2 people in Congress refuse to vote. They voted present on a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. They were Rashida Tlaib and Marjorie Taylor Greene. You see that the anti-Semitism works from both ways as well. Jews are all powerful, but they're weak vermin to be crushed, which may just be why I'm personally obsessed with keeping a normal, liberal, small L democracy going, because that is the safest world for Jews to live in. You might remember the reason I brought this up before the election, which was to show that splintering the Jewish community was really critical, not just electorally, but in terms of polarization. And now that we are here, more polarized than ever, with MAGA splintering over the issue of Israel, and I'll get to that in a second, I would like to propose that the United States has been at war with Iran and Russia for basically a decade now without even knowing it, because they've been conducting a hybrid war against us for several years in several different forms, which has worked to polarize us, to degrade our institutions, to make this insane timeline feel normal, for facts to become totally irrelevant, for public health to be degraded because people don't believe in germ theory anymore, to elect people who are absolutely out of their minds and who will appoint people who can't even stay sober for a meeting. There's evidence that they've been doing this for years. And I think in a few years, we're all going to look back and realize that we have been under various forms of attack for quite a bit. I also don't think it's just the United States. I think it's also the EU, plus Ukraine, Hong Kong, Israel. There's some evidence that Russia first attempted this in Crimea, and that was sort of a petri dish for how this worked. Then there's evidence that they did it during the 2016 election in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida, using the psychographics provided by Cambridge Analytica, courtesy of Facebook. And ever since, they have been perfecting this operation. They've gotten better at it. Their bots seem more real. Their protest tactics seem more plausible. And they have just continued to radicalize Americans algorithmically day by day. Here's the other way that our adversaries have outsmarted us. Because the United States just wants to fight back with military might and giant bombs while ignoring all of the other vulnerabilities that could hurt the country that are not military strikes. Our infrastructure is ridiculously vulnerable, not to mention it has not advanced in decades. It's crumbling. Our public health has been degraded. Life expectancy in the United States has declined. Here's how I think we've been at war without us even knowing it. Using a combination of normal warfare, military insurgencies, proxy wars in Ukraine, Syria, as well as cyber attacks, hacking Americans' data, using it to create fake profiles, using it to build psychographic profiles so that they can perpetuate propaganda, and very advanced digital strategies that they use on social media to polarize public opinion, coupled with on-the-ground tactics, which we know already they have been doing since 2016. So why would they not continue doing it when it works so well? I would bet they not only did this during election seasons, but during BLM, to try to make BLM more radical, the very well-funded campus protests over Gaza, not to mention that Qatar has been actively funding for several decades some of America's most elite schools. Tell me, why do Cornell and Texas A&M and Georgetown and Carnegie Mellon need to have outposts in Doha, in their education city? You think they're just doing that because they're generous? They want their kids to get in? If you believe that, I have a very large plane to sell you that nobody wants, also from Qatar. Back to the pre-election days for a second. When I had said that I was concerned that Jews who were supporting Trump were doing so blindly because Israel was such a top priority and they thought that he would be very tough on anti-Semitism and that he would be loyal to Israel or to Netanyahu, and I had said, no, he'll probably just stay loyal to Russia. And the hypothetical I threw out, I don't remember if I did this online or if I did this just in private conversation, what if Russia wanted the United States to not fund the Iron Dome, or maybe refuse to send a large bunker-busting bomb to their ally, Iran? This is much more in the bigger picture, but when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, Russia, Iran, and China want a multipolar world. They do not want what they call U.S. hegemony, which is a real thing. The United States being the #1 superpower, basically by military might and money. Good thing we fucked that up with the tariffs. Being isolationist also means not acting as Israel's muscle, which the United States very much is. Russia, China, and Iran want the United States to be isolationist and to withdraw from the global stage so that they can take that power and carve up little parts of the world that they might want. However, I think it's quite interesting that Trump, who we see is mostly under the influence of Russia, they are the only country he did not impose tariffs on, has yet to impose sanctions. The worst he said is, Vladimir, stop. I find it interesting that he's now suddenly pulling back on bombing Iran. 2 weeks, we all know what that means. Now, going back to our red-brown alliance, Russia and Iran don't like Israel either, especially Iran, obviously. But there has been anti-Zionist propaganda coming out of Russia since the very beginning. But what we saw in the Tucker Carlson-Ted Cruz interview was the splinter along the lines of Israel. He has positioned himself as an isolationist, as America first. The ones who are against it are the ones who are real isolationists and the people who tend to get behind Russia. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, you have Tucker Carlson, you have Tulsi Gabbard. The other split you're seeing in MAGA is a religious split. Ted Cruz, Mike Johnson, they're the evangelists / rapture people. They're gonna get behind Israel no matter what, because they think that the Jews all need to be in Israel so that they can kill us unless we convert, and that will make Jesus come back. So they're using us to get to Israel, while the other wing of MAGA, the more isolationists, tend towards wanting to set up dominion here in the United States, like the J.D. Vances, the Peter Thiels. They're not thinking about Israel as much either way, because they're not believing in the rapture either. So nothing in it for them. So yeah, every which way you look, bad for the Jews. I do think that if people understood that we were in an undeclared war, they might think differently about Iran. They might think differently about Russia and China as well. But in this particular instance, I think that leadership is way too focused on pure military might and how much they can achieve by bombing, when you've had our adversaries coming for us all along, just in a bit more of a creative way, you might say. And I don't think it's a coincidence that anti-Semitism, particularly under the guise of Zionism, has become en vogue when you consider that this has been going on for over a century from the same adversaries as we have now. Quick little disclaimer, I know that people have come to understand being anti-Zionist as being anti the Israeli government. That's not what it means, and that is not how I'm using it here. I don't believe that people who are against what the Israeli government is doing are anti-Semitic in most cases, but I need to reiterate that there are quite a few bad actors who are capitalizing on the internet and the way the algorithms work in order to demonize Jews under the headline of Zionist by calling what Netanyahu is doing Zionist. By the way, if you're not sure if Zionist is now being used as a slur, when you see a Jew being called a Zionist, ask how do they know? And what do they think should happen to them if they are? And you want to know how I know people mean it as a slur? Because no one ever uses it as a positive or neutral term, other than people who would identify as one.